In the decades following the Hinterkaifeck murders, amateur detectives and professional criminologists alike attempted to reconstruct the events of that fateful night using a combination of historical records, oral accounts, and modern analytical techniques. One challenge they faced was the sheer passage of time, which had eroded potential evidence and made first-hand testimony increasingly unreliable. Yet, despite these obstacles, the story continued to captivate imaginations, not only in Germany but internationally, as an enduring example of a crime that defied explanation. Researchers explored the idea that the killer or killers possessed intimate knowledge of the farm. Hinterkaifeck's isolated location meant that a stranger wandering into the area would likely have been noticed, yet reports indicated that the Gruber family experienced the presence of someone near the property without being able to identify them. This observation led to speculation that the perpetrator had either been observing the family for weeks or possibly even living secretly on the property prior to the murders. Some theorists suggested that Andreas Gruber had discovered the intruder and inadvertently triggered the violent outcome. Local folklore added another layer to the mystery. Stories of haunted farms, malevolent spirits, and curses were common in Bavarian villages, and Hinterkaifeck's tragic events quickly merged with these narratives. Some villagers claimed that the house itself seemed to exude a sense of dread, a physical manifestation of the horror that had occurred within its walls. Ghost stories and anecdotal accounts of strange noises, moving shadows, and unexplained footsteps reinforced the farm's reputation as a site of supernatural intrigue. While these stories were largely anecdotal, they shaped public perception and fueled speculation for decades. Theories regarding motive varied widely, reflecting the uncertainty surrounding the case. Some researchers focused on familial. The Hinterkaifeck murders, despite occurring over a century ago, continued to haunt investigators and enthusiasts alike. Every detail of the case was examined, and new theories constantly emerged as researchers reevaluated evidence with modern techniques. One notable focus was the behavior of the animals on the farm. Reports from neighbors suggested that the Grubers' cows and horses had become unusually agitated in the days before the murders, often appearing to sense an unseen presence. This detail, while anecdotal, contributed to the sense that the Gruber family had been living under constant surveillance and that the perpetrator may have been aware of these movements, using them to gauge the family's routines. The farm's layout itself played a role in the difficulty of solving the case. Hinterkaifeck consisted of the main farmhouse, a barn, and several smaller outbuildings. The surrounding woods provided both a sense of seclusion and a convenient route for someone familiar with the terrain to approach and depart unnoticed. Investigators noted that the barn, where some of the bodies were found, offered limited visibility from neighboring properties. This meant that a perpetrator could enter and leave without immediate detection, especially under the cover of snow and darkness. One particularly puzzling aspect of the case was the family's awareness of unusual activity before the murders. Andreas Gruber reportedly found footprints in the snow leading to the farm, but curiously, none seemed to leave. He also found small tools missing from the barn, and the family noticed items moved within the house. These signs suggested that the killer may have been living on the property for some time, observing the family and planning the attack meticulously. Modern criminologists have pointed out that this level of premeditation indicates a calculated individual who may have been obsessed with the Gruber family. The human element of the case also drew significant attention. The immediate aftermath of the Hinterkaifeck murders left the local community in shock. The people of the nearby villages struggled to comprehend how such a terrible crime could occur in their quiet, secluded corner of Bavaria. Families who had once felt safe in their homes now felt the chill of uncertainty. For weeks, conversations in the local taverns and markets were dominated by speculation about the motives behind the killings and the identity of the perpetrator. Fear mingled with fascination, as the inexplicable nature of the crime captured the imaginations of the townspeople. The local police faced intense scrutiny. Investigators were methodical, questioning everyone in the surrounding area, examining the farmhouse and its outbuildings, and meticulously documenting every detail of the crime scene. They cataloged evidence with care, yet the more they looked, the more frustratingly elusive the case became. There were no fingerprints, no clear signs of forced entry, and no confession. The footprints in the snow outside the farmhouse suggested a familiarity with the terrain that few outsiders could have possessed, but they did not match any known residents. The police speculated that the killer might have observed the Gruber family for weeks, learning their routines and exploiting their isolation. The farmhouse itself became an object of grim interest. Reporters and curious onlookers came from distant towns to catch a glimpse of the scene. Every detail was analyzed: the placement of furniture, the presence of personal belongings, the state of the animals, and even the peculiar condition of the garden and barn. The investigators noted that the bodies had been discovered in close proximity, but not all together, suggesting that the killer moved through the house with deliberate intent. There were questions about how the murderer managed to carry out the killings without alerting neighbors or attracting attention. The timing of the attack in the dead of night. In the remote countryside of Bavaria, Germany, in the early months of 1922, there was a small farm known as Hinterkaifeck. The farm, tucked away from the nearest village, was surrounded by dense woods and rolling fields. It was the kind of place that could easily be forgotten on a map, yet it was about to become infamous for one of the most chilling, unsolved crimes in history. The inhabitants of the farm were the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, a man in his mid-60s, was known in the nearby village as hardworking but reserved. His wife, Cecilia, was a gentlewoman, older than Andreas by a few years, and took care of the household with unwavering dedication. Their widowed daughter, Victoria, lived with them along with her children, Cecilia Jr., a young girl of around 7, and Joseph, a boy of about 6. They also employed a maid named Maria, a young woman who had worked for the family for some time. The family appeared normal to outsiders, yet those who observed the farm from a distance began to notice unusual activity weeks before the murders. Neighbors reported seeing footprints in the snow that led to the house, but strangely, none appeared to leave. There were reports of smoke rising from the chimney at odd hours, even when no one was supposed to be home. The family had mentioned to friends and neighbors that they sometimes felt watched. Objects in the house seemed to move on their own. Doors that were locked during the day were found open, and there were whispers of strange noises at night, footsteps, rustling, and occasional thuds in rooms where nobody should have been. At first, villagers dismissed these stories as overactive imaginations or the natural sounds of a farm in winter. But as the days passed, unease grew. Some neighbors recalled seeing shadows near the house, glimpses of someone standing silently in the woods at dusk. The family themselves became increasingly anxious. They were not just unsettled, they were genuinely afraid. A few weeks. The Hinterkaifeck murders, more than a century later, remain unsolved. But their legacy has not diminished. If anything, it has grown stronger with time. To understand why, one must recognize the unique blend of horror, mystery, and cultural resonance that the case represents. Unlike other unsolved crimes, which sometimes fade into the archives of police reports, Hinterkaifeck has become almost mythic. Its details, the isolated farm, the ominous footprints in the snow, the eerie sounds in the night, the careful but brutal murders, are cinematic in their vividness. These elements create a narrative that captures imagination across cultures and generations. Every retelling, whether academic or fictional, adds another layer to the story. At its heart, though, Hinterkaifeck is not about speculation or theories. It is about the silence left behind. 6 lives ended in violence, and with their deaths came an emptiness that no amount of theorizing can fill. This silence is perhaps why the case haunts so deeply. It represents the limits of human understanding, the reality that not all questions have answers. For the Gruber family and their maid Maria, the tragedy was immediate and personal. For the community, it was destabilizing, proof that even in the most familiar settings, horror could erupt. For Germany, it became a story woven into the cultural fabric, revisited with each generation as both warning and fascination. The final chapters of the Hinterkaifeck story belong not to the killer, but to memory. The farmhouse was demolished, its wood and stone scattered. The land returned to fields, as though nature sought to reclaim what human violence had corrupted. Yet memory refused to be erased. Survivors, villagers, and later historians carried the story forward, ensuring it would not vanish. The memorial cross erected near the site is simple in form, but heavy in meaning. It marks not only the location of a crime, but also the persistence of remembrance. Visitors who stand. By the early 21st century, the Hinterkaifeck murders had transcended their origins as a rural Bavarian tragedy and entered the global canon of true crime mysteries. Online forums, podcasts, documentaries, and books dissected every fragment of the story. The accessibility of archives and translation tools meant that researchers from around the world could examine German police reports, testimonies, and local histories. This globalization of interest ensured that Hinterkaifeck would never fade into obscurity. Instead, it became a case studied alongside infamous unsolved crimes like Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac killings. The digital age breathed new life into the investigation. Amateur detectives, often calling themselves armchair sleuths, combed through digitized records, comparing statements, timelines, and maps. They produced diagrams of the farmhouse, annotated photographs, and even 3D reconstructions. These collaborative efforts, while impressive, reached the same frustrating conclusion as official inquiries. There was no definitive suspect. Yet the process itself, the endless analysis, the shared pursuit of truth, became part of the Hinterkaifeck story. One striking feature of these online communities is their diversity. Historians focus on social context, criminologists analyze forensic details, psychologists speculate on the killer's mind, and folklorists explore the case's cultural afterlife. This interdisciplinary approach has turned Hinterkaifeck into more than a murder mystery. It has become a mirror reflecting the many ways humans seek to understand violence, fear, and the unknown. Among the most debated questions remains the identity of the killer. Modern analysts often return to the possibility that Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor and sometime rival of Andreas Gruber, had both motive and opportunity. His reported familiarity with the property, his involvement in inheritance disputes, and his suspicious behavior after the murders continued to draw. By the 1980s, Hinterkaifeck had evolved from a local tragedy into a subject of international curiosity. Criminologists, historians, and journalists from outside Germany began to explore the case, drawn by its eerie combination of brutality, mystery, and folklore. Academic conferences occasionally reference the murders as examples of cold cases that challenge the limits of investigation. At the same time, popular culture embraced Hinterkaifeck as a source of inspiration for novels, plays, and films. The blending of fact and fiction blurred the boundaries further, reinforcing the murders as both historical event and cultural legend. Local memory, however, remained more complex. For those who lived in the Bavarian countryside near the original farm, Hinterkaifeck was not a distant mystery, but a painful reminder. Families connected by blood or rumor to the Grubers or to early suspects carried a burden of association. Children grew up hearing the story not as entertainment, but as warning, a cautionary tale about isolation, secrecy, and the dangers of ignoring strange signs. This intimate connection between community and tragedy ensured that the murders were never fully abstract. They remained part of lived experience. In 2007, a significant development renewed attention to the case. German police cadets conducted a detailed review of the available evidence as part of a training exercise. Applying modern forensic theories and investigative techniques, the cadets reached a consensus on a likely suspect. However, out of respect for living relatives and the absence of irrefutable proof, the suspect's name was never made public. This conclusion highlighted both the progress of criminology and the ethical challenges of revisiting historical crimes. It also reinforced the mystery. The identity of the supposed killer remains locked in files, concealed from the public eye. This official silence only fueled further speculation. Amateur sleuths argued over the possible candida. In the years that followed, the Hinterkaifeck murders became more than just a case of brutal homicide. They became a lens through which society examined human nature, fear, and isolation. Each investigation, no matter how thorough, revealed the limits of early 20th century police work and highlighted the challenges posed by rural environments. The isolated location of Hinterkaifeck, combined with the harsh winter of 1922, created conditions that allowed a determined and knowledgeable perpetrator to act with impunity. Investigators repeatedly noted that the killer had demonstrated both patience and precision, carefully observing the Gruber family's routines before executing the murders with deadly efficiency. Despite extensive public interest and repeated investigations, the list of suspects remained long and inconclusive. From neighbors to distant relatives, former employees, itinerant workers, and local men with potential grudges, virtually every person connected to the area was considered at some point. Some were ruled out due to alibis, others because of lack of motive. Over the years, the inability to identify a definitive suspect led to growing frustration among authorities and a proliferation of theories in the press and among amateur sleuths. One line of inquiry focused on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a distant relative who had reportedly argued with the Grubers over property inheritance. While there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime, some theorists suggested that he possessed a motive rooted in jealousy or resentment. Investigators found his potential familiarity with the terrain compelling, but the absence of eyewitness accounts or tangible proof meant that suspicion alone could not lead to prosecution. Schlittenbauer himself consistently denied involvement, and historical records provide no direct connection between him and the night of the murders. Another notable theory implicated Joseph Weber, a former worker in nearby farms who had clashed